when you, again, go back to the wastewater industry, you're dealing with bacteria. You're setting up hardware and you're working with those bacteria. But you have to think about where those bacteria come from. 99% of the bacteria that enter into the waste stream come from toilets. It's fecal bacteria that have evolved to live inside the intestines of warm-blooded mammals like us humans. Now that means there are several characteristics that make these not simply an inappropriate bacteria, but almost the worst bacteria you could even design for the purposes. Number one, an intestinal bacteria has to have an extremely low appetite for carbon. You can't have hungry bacteria living in your stomach. They would compete with your food and you would starve, and the bacteria would get everything. So we've co-evolved with the bacteria in our intestine, and we only accept those that are very benign and have a very light appetite for organic carbon. Otherwise you couldn't survive. Second characteristic of these bacteria, they're living in a pretty hostile environment. We've got a lot of acids, stomach acids and enzymes in our intestines. In order for these bacteria, the intestinal bacteria, to survive, they secrete a mucus capsule around them. Now, all bacteria do that. They protect their cell membrane with a mucus coating. But intestinal bacteria produce copious amounts. I mean, it's like your banana slugs out here, you know. There's a lot of slime that they generate, and that is the actual cause of all these problems in these wastewater systems. The third thing is equally important, and that is intestinal bacteria live in a body that's at 98.6 degrees and doesn't vary more than a degree at all ever. So they have one of the tightest temperature ranges of any bacteria in nature. The minute they hit the toilet, they're literally in temperature shock. So it's a completely inappropriate group of bacteria to be using for wastewater treatment. Now, what we looked at was, if those are the characteristics of the wrong bacteria, what would be the characteristics of the right bacteria? Number one, you want a bacterium that's got a huge appetite for carbon, because that's its job. You put it in a wastewater system and give it air, you want it to eat everything as quickly as it can. Now it turns out there's a group of bacteria that have a huge appetite for carbon that live in the forest leaf litter zone of the soil in the forest leaf litter zone. They're dealing with a trillion tons of dead leaves every year. Their job is to make sure the Mount Everest is not covered in dead leaves, because it would be if they didn't eat all this stuff. So they consume that material. They have a very high appetite for carbon. The other thing, they don't produce mucus. They're living in an open environment. In fact, they create humic material and they make the soil even more absorbent. Another important component is they have a very wide temperature range. They've evolved in the natural environment, so they're exposed to very, very wide temperatures. Their temperature optimum is much lower than intestinal bacteria. And the other aspect of them is a lot of them are what we call facultative bacteria. They need oxygen and they grow and actively use oxygen for their metabolism. But let's say you've got a bunch of dead leaves and the rain comes. The rain comes and immediately saturates that zone. The oxygen suddenly disappears. The oxygen's used up because water just can't hold very much oxygen. Those bacteria then shift over to an anaerobic lifestyle. They're using oxygen still, but they're not getting it from the air. They're getting it from the food they eat. And one of the main foods they eat in that environment is cellulose, which is a long-chain sugar molecule. That's got oxygen in it. And that's what they do, is they actually ferment that material when they don't have oxygen available. And that's the whole key to being able to use them to open the soil. It's that aspect of the fermentation that they do. So they can live, so they're very flexible. They live wide temperature ranges, huge appetite. They do all the things we need for wastewater, so how do we get them in there? When you think about it, paper is the main solid going into most septic tanks or sewer lines. It's toilet paper. And when you pump a septic tank and you look at that material, what you realize, it's undigested toilet paper, most of it. And that's where one of the real advantages of these types of bacteria is they break that down extremely quickly. And so it helps keep your, it keeps solid buildup from occurring in these septic tanks. Again, the issue is, how did we get these bacteria to survive in an environment like a septic tank or any wastewater system? I looked at it and I realized that what I wanted was something that was compact, that had to have air because I needed to be able to grow the bacteria. And it also, I wanted it to be able to mix and do the kinds of things that are necessary for wastewater treatment. Really, it's a matter of aeration and mixing, and those are really the two, most important things. So we developed a column that's about 3 feet tall by 1 foot in diameter, and at the bottom of it is a microfine bubble diffuser inside of it. As the air rises through that column, it's displacing liquid in the column. So we have a little air pump that's sitting off by the house, and you have an air line that comes in, down into the unit, generates this stream of fine bubbles, and draws liquid in at the base of the unit, and forces it up through, so it circulates. And using only about a 40-watt air pump, we can actually mix or pump 15,000 gallons of liquid every day. And what that does is we set that into a septic tank that's 1,000 gallons. That means the entire content of that tank are drawn into that column and pass through it 15 times a day. We then take, in the center of it, we take a packet of the bacteria. So we take the bacterial blend is bacterial spores that we get from an actual bacterial supply house of about 5 different species. Blended in with a compost material that provides a sort of a nutrient base to create a mother culture. That sits right inside of the unit, so it's always getting air, and the air is then feeding the bacteria, and the bacteria then grow. And then we have a material inside of the column also that provides a huge surface area. So the bacteria settle and colonize all of that material. And that way, when we're drawing everything through, the bacteria are getting the food and the air right where they are. They consume the waste very rapidly, and then when it's gone, they simply die back and create spores, and they dry back, and so they sort of grow and shrink and grow and shrink, and that's why they never build up an actual sludge residual. Again, the object originally was to be able to put it in the tank to grow the bacteria, get them to pass out into the leach field and get at the organic material that clogged the soil in the leach field. At first we didn't realize that it would become an actual treatment system in and of itself. It was really just a bacterial generator. But because we designed it so efficiently and took advantage of all the different aspects of hydrology and so forth, it ended up being a very powerful treatment tool. When you're dealing with high strength, you need a very substantial population of bacteria because there's a huge amount of food that has to be digested. Because the sledgehammer can generate the bacteria rapidly, then we can use that, and with high strength we can either do pre-treatment for a final polishing unit, or we go directly into it. The highest strength I've worked in so far is a winery in Sonoma County called Dumal Winery. Very prominent winery. We measured their raw waste coming into that system, and it's between 15,000 and 20,000 BOD, so it's incredibly high strength winery waste. And that system this last year, it took quite a bit of engineering, and again, when we do high strength, the sledgehammer is a component of a treatment design. You just don't put the unit in and expect it to do miracles. It's no different than any other tool. You have to use it correctly, and so that means you have some filtration where you might have excessive solids you have to remove. In the winery we had pH issues, so we had to control the pH. But we were able to knock the BOD from 15,000 down to about 200, and it was hooked into the sewer line for the city of Windsor, and the city said, you have to, in order for you to hook up to our sewer, you've got to get your waste down below 1,750 milligrams per liter, or we won't accept it. Well, we got it way down below that. We got it down almost to 200, which is about the equivalent of just a standard home going into the sewer line. So the city was delighted. There's an international certification called MARPOL, which is the International Maritime Organization. IMO has an international treaty. In order for ships to discharge into international waters, they have to treat their waste to a high degree, and they have a process to test it, and we tested that. And what they do is, in order to run that test, you have to use a high-strength waste as your source. Part of that's because ships tend to separate out. They'll have a gray water system, and then they'll have a black water system. The gray water is the showers and stuff like that, and the sinks, so it's not very strong. If you're only treating black water, which is the toilet waste, it's going to be much higher strength. And so to test under MARPOL, they assume you're only treating the black water. And so we had to actually, to do the test, we actually had to concentrate the effluent from a wastewater treatment plant and use it at a much, much higher strength to pass it. And we're now certified under MARPOL. There's actually 3 standards. We've passed 3 different standards. The first one is called IATMO, which is the International Association of Mechanical and Plumbing Officials, or Plumbing and Mechanical. That's a test that shows you can recover a failed leach field. So that's one standard. The other standard that we passed is the NSF 40. Now the NSF 40 standard is for systems for homes up to 1,500 gallons per day. And the NSF 40 standard is you have to test it and show over a 6-month period you can meet what would be equivalent to a secondary wastewater treatment plant. So you have to get a BOD of 25 and a total suspended solids of 30. And we passed that standard. And that's using just regular domestic waste, or domestic strength waste. It's in a sewer plant, so they just could use the sewage coming in. The MARPOL, we actually had to take that same test site. We actually brought the raw waste in, and then we had to let it settle into a tank and supernate off the liquid from above and use the concentrated stuff below in order to actually run the test. So the MARPOL is a much more stringent standard. And the MARPOL also has a standard for fecal coliform. So we had to use UV sterilization because it's discharging into the water, so it's got to be disinfected. Whereas NSF is just for soils.